Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for waiting. Welcome to the Body and Spirit lecture series for today's talk, tantalizingly titled, Exhibiting the Body, Compulsions, Caveats, and Cautions. And allow me to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Naman Ahuja is Professor of Art History at JNU India, where he's also Dean of the School of Art and Aesthetics. He's the General Editor of Mark, India's oldest publishing house dedicated to art and culture. But importantly, he has also curated some of the most important exhibitions on Indian art in the past 10 years. And this includes The Body in Indian Art and Thought, which was shown in Brussels and in Delhi in 2013, and India and the World, in which 120 objects from the British Museum were staged in strategic dialogue with Indian objects, and that was exhibited in Mumbai and in Delhi. So these exhibitions have received critical acclaim for generating narratives of Indian history within a globalized world cognizant of issues of caste, gender, comparative religion, and decolonization. So in today's talk, he will be exploring and addressing whether the body offers alternative narratives for history museums. So without further ado, I'm sure we're all excitedly waiting for Dr. Naman Ahuja to give us the talk.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. And you've all been very hospitable. And it's been a very lucky break for me to be able to get away, but more importantly, to be able to have the chance to reflect on the exhibition on the body, which has taken on a force in my life that I never thought it would. I was invited in 2010-11 to curate this exhibition and come up with a narrative for presenting Indian history to the world. It was to be shown at the Palais des Beaux-Arts and in Brussels. And I thought that, for all of one's education and learning about how exhibitions must not turn into Orientalist extravaganzas that please some kind of ridiculous notion of India to the West, I found myself that when I was given the challenge to present an exhibition on the world stage, I had to really rack my brains as to how I was not going to end up falling down the road of the very same cliches that I had critiqued. How was I going to prevent India from being shown as a culture mired by religion, transcendentalism, a land of spirituality, yogis, snake charmers, and profligate maharajas? There had to be a way to be able to take it out of those stereotypes, and to be able to puncture those stereotypes in some way. And then the next question became, how do we present history in today's day and age? Because the social sciences and academia have moved into a completely different circuit of thinking and presentation, when sociology and anthropology are as important as a component for the study of art. You have to understand art in the context that it was made. It's not just about, I don't mean to belittle it, it's not just a study of line and form and color and texture and volume and all of those issues that we study as art students, which are extremely important, and you spend lifetimes trying to hone those talents, and yet at the same time, our line, color, form, texture, volume is a response to our social environment. It is in response to certain provocations. It is because of our personal involvement within a wider world. And as a result, the psychology of the maker, as much as the context of the environment in which the object is made, are as valuable for the museum discourse as the object itself, as the house of the making of the object. And so how does one then satisfy all three disciplines of social anthropology or visual culture, of art making, line and form, and of psychology, which has become something inextricable from academic studies across the social sciences. And there had to be a way to be able to bring these matters into dialogue. And as that conversation built up, it became obvious that we were also dealing with a completely political exhibition, because the body becomes the space on which conflicts are perpetrated, on which crimes are committed. The response of the artist to a particular situation, that prayer that is devoted to that particular deity, is to take you out of the suffering. It's the suffering that you're talking about then as the context that leads to that, not just the image of the god, but it is the suffering that led to the worship. It's the gratitude felt on account of something that led to the worship. Is the museum then going to absolve itself of the narratives of the people's gratitude, occasions for suffering, the causes for their conflict? The minute that comes into the museum space, we are told, but really, we come to the museum to please ourselves for a little bit of art and a little bit of time out from the quagmire of our daily lives, and here you are presenting it to us in spades. What is the job of the museum curator? If the museum curator is supposed to be such a great expert as to be able to tell you about the spiritualities of the cultures of Asia, for heaven's sake, Asia, the libraries of the world of Arabic, Asia, Chinese, Asia, Tibetan, Asia, Sanskrit and Pali, Tamil, Gujarati, and everything else put together are more voluminous than the libraries of the rest of the world put together. The amount of manuscripts and texts, can the museum curator ever be ambitious enough to be able to put the body and all that it has generated in thought and spirit into a single exhibition? And so comes the caveat and caution in my title. It isn't possible. And yet, we have to be able to do something with temporary exhibitions that act as provocations for the audience to start thinking about a whole new set of questions, about being able to juxtapose objects in interesting ways, to be able to see how different people might have responded to the same problems and stimuli similarly or differently. So the same suffering, but completely different responses across cultures. Your gallery can be about that particular moment of suffering, and you can see the varied responses it has evoked. Or it can be an occasion to be able to trace commonalities. Oh, look, we are just like you. Now, both of those are perfectly valid as long as we're doing both, of evoking both those responses in our audiences. Because too much sameness ends up being an act of propaganda, almost. To be able to say to everyone, oh, we're all the same, and after all, we're all the same, let conflict go. And this is sort of forced bonhomie that is enforced on the viewing public. Whereas the other chance is to be able to stage difference. And then the audience turns around and says, hey, what, those guys do it differently. And it's okay, that's different. It's not the same as our response, but it's their response. And so we become aware of and make a space for that difference in the gallery space, for a recognition of that difference, to be able to abide by and live with that difference. And that's an equally important demand for a multicultural society, for the museum to be able to perform in a multicultural environment. So exhibitions on the body have been growing, and I didn't quite appreciate what one was unleashing. Studies on embodiment actually became the mainstay of social anthropology, possession rituals and things like that, right from the beginning of the inception of the discipline of anthropology, really. But what we've been noticing is that time and again, museums in the world have particularly focused on the human fascination with self-representation, which is something as old as art itself. And how does one actually deal with this? And where all does one deal with it? Right from the Ice Age on through the most ancient representations in the world, to now radical new discoveries which are coming up to say that, make us examine the fact that art and anthropomorphism does not stay limited, even in form, even in studies on sculptural form or physical representation, to verisimilitude. It doesn't stay limited to verisimilitude. It's not about an exact replica of the human being. Instead, we see that the art making or object making has from the very beginning been a space where the sculptural body and form can morph into something else. It can take on the attitude and representative qualities of something else that gets mixed in with the human spirit. Immediately, the word spirit seems to come into our title, the one that you've chosen for this exhibition that's going on over here. Art making has seldom, very rarely, been constrained by exact naturalism, exact verisimilitude. In fact, it has often lent itself to, more often than being perfectly representative, it has more often been a space where instead art making has been about the morphed quality to be able to show an expression of an emotion, a spirit, an energy, which is what you're trying to capture. And so it is the thought behind it, it is the matters of spirit which are inherent in art making, and the body can never be thought of in art without that component. So it becomes a vehicle for capturing the various moods, energies, or values that don't just drive people, but also drive society. Studies in art history have been making the subject of the body their focus, particularly since the 1990s. And one could argue that this is something that has not just emerged in the past few decades, but it has always been the center of art making. So one should really pose a different kind of question. What's really shifted in the past few decades? Why do we have so many exhibitions going on in the world which deal with the body? And I think one of the key things to consider is that the subject affords several disciplines to come together. Medicine and art, for instance, the physical body, and art that has a very rich history about how medicine and art come together. Dance and ritual come together. The issue of psychology, as I was saying, and nowadays, it's the Anthropocene, the effect of humans on ecology. Now, this elastic nature of the subject can be redefined to hold relevance for each new audience. Museums preserve material objects. These are vestiges of what people put effort into making. These objects are often linked to rites of passage, marking the stages of what bodies must pass through. Each community can mark these stages differently. How did they make that object, and why did they make that object, are the questions I would ask everyone to ask when they encounter the objects in the exhibition upstairs. How is it made, and why is it made? What ideas or conditions drove them to make those things? These matters are as important as an appreciation of the thing itself. And this, as I was explaining, makes anthropology as important a study of the museum curator, as much as the museum curator may fancy herself or himself as a religious pontiff. Because we're constantly reading Vedas and Puranas and the Gita and the Bible and the Quran and the Hadith and the this and the that. My God, we've turned into our discipline as art historians has become as much about the study of comparative religion as it has become a study of line and form and texture and volume. I mean, it's as much about that. And so it is the coming together of both these disciplines. In turn, as I was saying, imagery has an effect on how people think. Like, this is a truism. Anyone in the field of advertising, for instance, knows this all too well. Images condition our perception of matters of sexuality, of matters of gender. They condition the way in, this is not just true now, it was also the case in history, where images made you think a certain way. They informed the sensibilities of the body politic, not just the body personal. So what kinds of bodies have been regarded as being an exemplar? What kind of body was regarded as being an ideal? Makes for a fascinating comparative history. Given that no one subject can be studied in isolation, these exhibitions on the body have allowed us to bring a more holistic, interdisciplinary way of looking at artifacts and presenting those to the public. This, perhaps, is where we now need to locate the shift that is apparent in modern museum exhibitions, where old separations of museums into museums of anthropology and ethnography can be combined with the museums of history or museums of art, where religion and society of literate societies can be combined with the histories of non-literate societies to be able to present a more equitable presentation of culture. This also turns museum exhibitions into a participatory space, where culture is not preserved like some taxidermist's assemblage of dead specimens, but one that resonates with people's practices, which is something that is beautifully brought out with the entrance of this museum's, well, this exhibition has several entrances. And so one of the displays of this exhibition is where you see the Tamil practice of the kavadi carrying of the milk and water in the temple Ratha Utsav, the temple ritual. And it's absolutely extraordinary because it's taken on a life in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaya, which is only seen now, I think, in a few places still in Tamil Nadu, where it is still practiced with the same vigor with which you see it practiced here. And they are extraordinary. It is all about the body and the transformative effect of pain into pleasure, and suffering and martyrdom as a cause for emancipation of the spirit, about the loss of the self for a greater cause of the divine, abnegation, but also pleasure that is intrinsically part of it, vanity, and theater, which cannot be divorced from it, the affective space of something like this. And I think your museum here has done an absolutely marvelous job in categorizing it and documenting it in the way that you have. And I think that's something which is rare, and I don't think anyone's done that till now. And so this is going to be extremely useful as a document to be able to have for all that it means in the much anticipated catalog, which will, I'm sure, be with us quite soon of this exhibition. Now, with such vast possibilities, it becomes a curatorial challenge to be able to define the remit of any museum exhibition that endeavors to make the body its focus. The problem is that in a time when micro-specialization has become the norm in all fields, I mean, you can't go to a doctor and ask him to look at both your knee and your heart and your head. You know, just, it can't, how dare you? You know, it doesn't happen anymore, right? You need to make 3 different appointments, at least, if not 9, you know, and to be able to get to the specific micro-specialist to be able to look at that aspect of your kidney and not the other aspect of your kidney. Art history, too, has become part of this micro-specialization. And this makes the management of public institutions like museums quite difficult, because the museum now has to contend, on the one hand, with the depth of research available through highly specialized writing, And on the other hand, to serve the needs of diverse publics, to make them acquainted with each other's disciplines, which require something quite preliminary to be exposed to the public. How are you performing the role both of being a generalist who is performing an introductory service to different communities, and at the same time being the institution that has to serve the requirement of being relevant and important because of the depth of higher research that you are facilitating in your institution? Museum management, as a result, is really quite affected by this double bind. It is a very difficult predicament. An equally difficult problem in an age of migration, which is particularly attendant to museums in Singapore, for instance, comes the issue of refugees and diasporic cultures. Trying to define what comprises the culture of a region is not an easy task. Should the museum focus on the history of the place or the history of the cultures of the people who live in that place? People who don't come from there, but come from other places. So therefore, does it become a museum of other places? Or is it a museum of that place? How do you define place? And this is actually quite serious because it happens all the time. It's very complex because you'll have populations that want to know about their history and share that with other populations in that. And that requires the museums to be performing a role of the histories of diverse places. And that's quite important. It's not just happening in Singapore. Singapore actually has taken the lead in this because post the Second World War, the kind of population shifts that we are dealing with across the world now, because of war or because of natural calamities and so on, there's such major demographic shifts taking place across the world that we do really need to think about mobility much more seriously. Okay, so as I was saying, exhibitions on the body have become sort of really popular. And if I may be permitted to say what has shifted since the body in Indian art and thought was presented was that I tried to find ways in which to be able to bring these different narratives into a museum discourse, to make galleries that are about these kinds of issues, where the vectors that cut across them, so for instance, my opening gallery was on death, the end of the body. Why? Well, we all want a picture, we all want a photograph of somebody we've lost to remember them by. All too often, people may have no other work of art or representation in their lives but the photograph of someone they loved. Making a picture of somebody, making art, is one of the main reasons for making art. Memorialization, commemoration is one of the great reasons for making art. As we think about this more, one of the main reasons why temples were ever built was in memory of someone. One of the main reasons why stepwells, and they were all dedicated to the memory of an ancestor, made by a loving relative, so that water may be given at the well for centuries to come in the name of your ancestor. You do something to mark your father, you mark your mother, to mark your brother or sister, or your beloved in some way. And you put in your resources into constructing something in their memory. And that's for the public good. So death becomes a major reason for making of art and for celebrating something which we in museums tend to represent. Now, cutting across, therefore, looking at death then allowed me to be able to look at it in intersectional ways. Were women's lives commemorated in the same way as men's lives? Do we in the institutions of our museums celebrate tribal lives as much as we do classical societies and literate societies' lives? Do we represent them and do we show the dialogue and how they do the same thing for the same? So it became a provocation to be able to have an equalizing impulse and see the varied responses that come to it in the gallery. And this worked quite well. So similarly, we did it for other thematics. And the thematics proved to be quite successful as binding forces for creating gallery narratives. And it's been quite amazing to see how popular this has now become across the museum world. So on the slide here, you can see the Smithsonian currently has this exhibition going on called Body Image, Art of the Indian Subcontinent, for instance. It's going on at the moment, which is completely, it's exactly almost same dates as this exhibition that's going on over here. We had in San Francisco, we had Divine Bodies. Again, in the Career Museum, we had the body from spiritual to sensual. We had healing, knowing, seeing the body in the Spencer Museum of Art. We've had the museum in San Francisco. This is Smith College did this, and the San Francisco one, I think, did that. So, I mean, it's going on. These are just ones that are current in the past 2-3 years. If I was to take out a list of the ones that have happened in the past 10 years, it would actually be a very substantial list. And what's interesting is that the gallery titles, it's not just the main exhibition subject, but it is about what they've done. And the word healing, knowing, seeing. The words spiritual to sensual. There are certain key thematics which are emerging in these exhibitions of the body, which is why it brings me to the fundamentals of why I curated it the way I did. And it's made me really, your exhibition and your invitation to come here and think about these issues made me really do a deep dive and do, as I say, the body redux, to actually go back into thinking about what was it that prompted me to create the galleries and the thematics that I did. And what was the rationale behind them. Now, when I conceived the entire way in which museum discourse could work with the body and why I think it was valid for history museums to have it, I created galleries that would balance each other, that were complementaries. So, for instance, you'll see that death is exactly opposite a gallery on immortality, which is the body of God, the supernatural, immortal. Now, when people entered the gallery on death, they had a choice. They could turn counterclockwise, the Vamachari, the Tantric way, and enter lust, desire, rapture. And through lust, desire, rapture, go counterclockwise and come back to death this way. Or they could enter death and go to nothingness, into the land of the spirit, by turning right. So you had a choice as the audience participant to go left or right. And the ones that ended up going one way, you had to also think about the fact that, well, all this exhibition about the body and the body being the cause for healing, knowledge systems, seeing, sensuality, and all of these issues. But what about those who don't believe in representing the body? Like, they don't make art that deals with the body. Now, are there anthropologies, histories, psychologies then going to be denied from the museum discourse because they make no bodies? They don't use the body as the metaphor, as the vehicle for telling all these stories. One can't be so self-congratulatory that one refuses to see that there might be counter-opinions which just don't believe in the discourse on the body or use the body as their metaphor and as their tool. Then what do you do as a museum curator? And so aniconism, nothingness, the absence of the body, had to become a subject in itself, I felt, and that needed to be staged to talk about that. And so that became the aniconic body as a subject of the gallery. So rapture and aniconism then balanced each other. We could then go from that, from aniconism into birth, or in most Asian religions, a case of rebirth. And the rebirth gallery was divided into 3 segments. One dealt with what was the cause for what is matter. If something is reborn, there must have been a first birth. At some point, there must have been creation for it to have been reborn, right? It can't just be in an eternal cycle of rebirth without there having been an initial impulse of birth of some kind for something to be reborn. And so we had that as 3A, and 3B was what is the agent through which that rebirth takes place. And so we dealt with goddesses and the idea of the mother as one of the constitutive elements of goddesses, but not the only constitutive element, but one of. And then the third thing was we looked at birth stories. We looked at miraculous conception, miraculous children. And we did a comparative analysis of Hindu birth stories and Islamic birth stories and Christian birth stories and Buddhist birth stories, Jain ones, and put them all together. And it sparked some very interesting conversations in the audience. Then came the next gallery. Sorry, I should say birth was countered with a gallery on asceticism. The ascetic who takes a vow to opt out of society and is not a cause for birth himself or herself anymore. So that person opts out of social systems, of social hierarchies, of caste systems, of all the things that happen through birth. So he exits the system. So birth and asceticism become sort of complementaries as ideas. Then the question is that when birth takes place, is birth governed by the cosmos? Is it governed by do you have personal agency in how to shape your lives? Or is it predestined? And this becomes an eternal dialogue again. And that became a good question to enter that. So heroism, where you take agency and you have inspiration in your life and you create social exemplars, heroism and the cosmic control became the two ways of thinking about the matter, and they became opposite ways of being able to deal with it. Now, these 8 themes take us not so much into the corporeal physicality of the body, but into what is inherent within it, what motivates it, what drives or what guides the way in which the body is thought of. The questions we asked were universal, but the answers presented a plurality of Indian responses to these questions. And that sparked off exciting conversations. So, for instance, with the gallery on death, we decided to enter the gallery not through the images of gods, but through the memorials to people. Fantastic hero stones. Women commemorated as a pillar with their hand up for having committed sati. They're not celebrating it, but we're telling an important aspect of life. That sati stone, interestingly, doesn't come from a Rajput kingdom of Rajasthan, which is the cliche, but comes from the Chennai Museum. You know, people just imagine that this was some North Indian Rajput custom. We need to there's so much in history that we need to learn and relearn. So this comes from a site in southern Andhra Pradesh. Used to be I don't know whether it's now Telangana or Andhra. I mean, I always get confused now with the new maps. But let's just say the northern limits of Tamil Nadu is where, somewhere in that region where it would have come from. Before it, you see a man with a rifle squatting. He's a Naga warrior, remembered. And I deliberately wanted the exhibition to start from the southern part of India and from the eastern part of India, rather than start the exhibition with some example from North India once again. Because, you know, how we display an object and how we want to welcome our audience, they're subtle things. They're small things that we play with as curators all the time to make little interventions in how we wish to narrativize. What history do you want to privilege? What are the correctives that society needs at that moment to be able to encounter a culture? And you make a small intervention. So on a world stage, am I actually entering India through the regular cliche of some North Indian sculpture or through a Nataraj, or am I actually going to start with the people and their lives? We came to another cliche that I wanted to puncture, this extraordinary sculpture, because we are always told that Indian art knew no verisimilitude, that Indian art was always abstracted and stylized. But it's not true. We have extraordinary, highly well understood, anatomically correct, sculpture, which does exist and presages the stuff that was made in Tibet and Nepal, which does show similar verisimilitude, associated also with Tantric and Shaivite imagery. So it's important to be able to look at that. I'm not going to go on about these Sati stones, I've already shown them to you. But other kinds of Indian art that people need to see, which they often forget about, certain aspects of Indian art. And let's not forget what was happening in Agra at the end of the 16th century with one of the most important Jesuit churches that was patronized by the Emperor Akbar, which this museum has previously shown some fantastic examples of. And the exhibition catalogue of Christianity in Asia that exists in your museums shows, in the list of shows, was a landmark exhibition, I think, for this reason. And I learned much from it, I have to say. So the body, when I said on aniconism, the most important aspects of Hindu thought is that are these terms like nirakar, nirguna, arup, beyond form, that which has no qualities, that which has no physical shape, formlessness, matters of the spirit. It's not just Islamic art that believes in no bodies. The dialectic between to represent and not to represent goes back right the way through Hindu worship to the most ancient texts that have this debate on whether art should be manifested and fill up spaces and bodies should be represented. There are as many that don't believe in temple worship. And then if you get deeper and deeper into the sacred texts that talk about temple worship and making of art, the rituals of a lot of the smarta rituals in the Brahmins talk about the making of a cosmic diagram or a mandal anywhere. You can make a temple here, worship, and the temple can be rubbed out and it's over. It's a temple for that time. That's it. Used ephemerally. So these ideas were as important because it showed the limits of museology. It showed what the limits of our institutions are, and that we can never hope to become the spaces that talk about, that represent the full gamut of what religion is about. We can only ever show an aspect, some aspects, but we can never be responsible enough to show all of Islam and all of Hinduism and all that Buddhism believes in. The same thing happens in Buddhism. I mean, aniconism and iconism. It's a big standing debate within Buddhist philosophy and thought as well. So the kind of thinking which does not believe in materialism and materiality finds little mention and inclusion in a museum space. We are left only with the display and the diagrams of the kavadi, of the ritual. But what animated that ritual? Well, we can nowadays get a video clip of it, of its use as a contextualizing tool, which is the new direction in which a lot of our museums are having to go in, which is a lot of the documentation of the anthropological context. And that's become a significant part of what we as institutions now have to do. So Jain diagrams of that nothingness, etc. I'm not going to get into it, but there's also another thing, for as much as we as art historians and artists are optically conditioned to be able to look at something, we also have to know that objects are there to be touched. They're also there to be used. They're there to be drunk from. They're there to be able to wear inside as a talisman, to not be exposed to the public, to never let it be seen, but it's something within. Objects can perform many other reasons, and yet when we study Asian art, we always talk about icons that are in the temple and darshan and looking and ways of seeing is what we're always talking about, but objects are not just about ways of seeing. And so there are all these other things that objects do which we need to keep in mind as we look at the limits of art history. So that takes us to the gallery on rebirth. And as we were looking at that, as I said, the first section dealt with conceptual ways of the birth of an idea. I'm not looking into that with you right now. I don't have, if we want to talk about it later and we have time, then I might spend a few minutes on that. But otherwise, what we need to think about this whole idea of goddesses as mothers, on which we had an entire gallery. And then we looked at birth stories, immaculate conception stories. And these were fascinating. So just a few examples. The ideal Hindu family. Kartikeya, born without Parvati's involvement. Shiva's seed fertilizes in Ganga. It's carried by the rishis, the Sapta rishis' wives. Then the fetus is transferred further and ends up with the Kritikas, the Pleiades, the constellation. By the time this baby is fully formed and born, Kartikeya or Skanda Murugan, whatever name you want to know him by the time this child is born, he doesn't have, his paternity is not in doubt, but his maternity is contested, right? And with the maternity being contested, everyone, all these women that played a hand in this child's birth claimed to be his rightful mother. Fantastic contest plays out. And as these mothers, diverse mothers, the 6 Kritikas, the Saptarishis' wives, the Ganga, and all the ogresses who could have consumed this baby at any time during the gestations, multiple gestations that this baby has been through, all those ogresses all claim that they are all rightful mothers for having played a part in the creation of this baby. At which point Parvati steps in and says it is her husband's baby that they are talking about, and therefore claims the right to be the mother. What happens in the case of Ganesh, the other child of the Hindu holy family? It's her child born without him, right? Famously. And yet this family is the Hindu ideal family, Shiv and Parvati with her son and his son, forming a unit. You have the case of the birth of the Jain Tirthankaras in the Kalpasutra stories, which are very powerful stories. The conception takes place in the womb of a woman of one caste, and then this character called Harinaigameshan performs a kind of an in vitro transfer, and the womb and the baby is transferred into, the fetus is transferred into the womb of a woman of a different caste. So when the baby is born, what caste is the child? So you have fantastically powerful myths that throw into questions one of the fundamental regulators of society about caste system, for instance, is thrown upended because of that. That the hero that society is worshipping doesn't come from any one caste, and birth is not a predicator. Being born into a particular caste is not there. A very powerful political tool this myth was, these myths have been. Then you get the story of, let's say, the birth of Rustam and the birth of Buddha, which are these miraculous births, or the birth of Mary or Jesus, sort of miraculous stories, each one captured in art. Or let's look at the story of the birth of Krishna. Born to one mother. All over India, the most celebrated baby's ritual is Janamashtami, right? The most famous of the baby rituals that takes place in August every year usually. And everyone celebrates this little baby. Well, what's the story? I mean, everyone's become this great love story between a mother and child, are these poems and poems that are created on the birth of Krishna, on the love between this mother and child. It's an adopted child. It's not her biological child. This great love story between a mother-son relationship is that between an adoptive mother and her baby. And that's again, something, the aspects of these stories which are quite relevant for our times. It's just that what aspect of the story are you willing to tell? What aspect are you going to communicate? Because the myths do contain very powerful stories. And so we had Harinagameshan, or we had this painting of the birth of Mary, or the birth of the Gandharan relief, which shows the birth of the Buddha, etc. And I said, we come into the bodies and the cosmos as a gallery. And in your gallery upstairs, you'll see a fantastic manuscript that shows the lines on the palm. And what you see over here is a wonderful prophylactic that was made for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. It's for a Cancerian man to look upon. The sight and meditation on a particular image can be transformative. And so this was a book of talismans, which was supposed to have supernatural effect on the viewer. And I love this manuscript. It's in the Rampur Raza Library because it throws a real challenge to art makers. Tell an artist, how will you create a situation where you have to not represent, but represent the antidote for the Aquarian man who loses his inheritance, for the Capricorn woman whose husband is cheating? Create a visual antidote for that problem. So you have to first understand the problem on the Capricorn woman whose husband is cheating on her, and then create an antidote to that. And then you have to do one for the Gemini woman and for the Cancer woman and for the Virgo woman, and you have to do all of them. And then the antidotes for all of them. And I find this an artistically compelling manuscript for that reason. Yeah, I think just the sheer challenge of having to come up with these, and it's page after page after page, and they're large pages. So it's quite a remarkable manuscript. There are fantastic works of art which have been enabled because of notions of cosmology. And that became a very good category, another big rubric to be able to see why art is made. And so deities of the cosmos, which exist in a lot of art making. What I was trying to do with my exhibition was that I tried to find 8 large categories, 8 iconological categories, as it were, that presented reasons why art is made, the provocations and the circumstances that allow people to make art, or societies to make art. And I examined those provocations in each gallery. And I think that's really the rationale behind it, ultimately, the main rationale behind it. And that allowed us to look at a remarkable array of art. This sculpture is about quite big. It's about 14 feet high, and Capricorn Makar Rashi makes up his shoulders, his mustache are 2 fish, the mean Mithun, the crab Cancer makes up his chin, Leo makes up his knees, etc. He is the cosmos. He is Shiva as the cosmos. And this idea of the cosmic man is turned into a game board, which I love as one of the great things in art, in Indian art. Game boards for the Gyan Chopad, which is a game that is played by Sufis, by Vajrayanists, by Jains, by Shaivites, and by Vaishnavs. So it's across North India that you will get these game boards. And the game board is a cosmic man. You'll see that 2 arms, 2 legs, the eyes on top, contain the body, the cosmos, within the figure of the man, which is divided into different stations as a snakes and ladders game board. Good virtues in that religion will be a ladder that will take you up, and performing a crime or a vice will allow you to be bitten and brought down. So every station is marked with some words, and it tells you what it is, some quality, some condition, some way of thinking. So 75, for instance, has the word ahankar on it, ego. And if you still have ego and ahankar at 75, if you've still not managed to rid yourself of it, you will be bitten by a snake, and you'll be brought right the way down, and your life has to start, you have to go through the stages of life again. Just for example. And so the ones who have certain virtues will go all the way up to 90 and get to 100 quickly. So an ideal life is mapped onto the game board, and the lessons of life are mapped on. And so there were hundreds of these game boards that were produced. And we managed to show one. But now, looking at this visually, from examples of the cosmic being, which are there in Jain art and in Shaivite art, turned into a game, turned into, here you see the boxes, turned into the checkerboard, becoming the body of the cosmic man. And then we see the checkerboard around the person. One system of knowledge, of science, as it was in medieval and ancient times, was as pernicious as modern systems are for regulating the body, for racial classification, for anthropometry. After all, modern science regulated the people and the tribes and the communities of Asia and India in the name of racial superiority of the Caucasian or of the Aryan, to be able to measure people, to be able to see whether they were fit to be subjugated and colonized. That's also another narrative of how knowledge systems cannot be regarded as being absolute. They're equally difficult histories to be told, whether through ancient systems of knowledge, which sought to regulate and control society, just as modern systems of knowledge have been equally difficult ways of being able to, in the name of, each one did it in the name of science, the regulation. So it was about understanding social control. And so the exhibition was no longer looking at the body as the self, as isolated, but looking at the social systems that governed the body. So cosmos created, living within the body, takes us to look at the idea of the supernatural body, which took me into ways of thinking about, after all, even these supernatural bodies are artistically conditioned ideals for society. So how are those ideals governed? What is the different proportion system that is used for creating perfect bodies? Are there different kinds of perfect bodies? So you'll go upstairs and you'll see Chamunda or Kali, frightening apparition. You'll see a chubby little baby Krishna or a little pot-bellied Ganesh. God in every form, as the withered old woman, God as the little baby, God as the pot-bellied, God as the aquiline. God comes in any form. And there are precise artistic rules for how to make that perfect pot-belly, how to make that perfect muscular being, and how to make that perfect withered woman who's with hollowed stomach and sagging breasts. You can't just make it just like that. There are rules for how to make it well. It is a goddess. And I think that's what is important, that we need to think about the artistic rules that also exist for each of these conditions. So, for instance, Gopinath Rao found the ancient Shilpa Shastras, and from the Agamas reconstructed these diagrams, which I've just shown for the Chatushtalam, the four stages, the body divided into four, whereas for Vishnu's body, it would be the Dashatalam, body divided into 10. For the Kinnara or the Gandharva, it would be the Tritalam, the body divided into 3, and so on, other systems of making the perfect body. So just as one, so the idea of what we regard, and then so popular is this idea of making bodies that it has an extraordinary effect. Like Buddhists who did not believe in making images of the Buddha, right? Because the Buddha himself forbade it. 3 times Ananda asked him, Master, what shall we do with your body once you are gone? How shall we remember you? And 3 times, twice he declined, and he said that you have my sayings, and that's enough. You don't need any more than that. And on the 3rd time, he capitulated and said, well, do with my body as you would with the Chakravarti. You can bury me in a stupa, meaning to say, right? You can put my relics in a stupa. And so some physicality and corporeality of the Buddha gets commemorated, and he gives reluctantly sanction for that. And upstairs you will see some of the most sacred and important relic remains, which is the privilege of a lifetime to be able to see it truly. I mean, it was the highlight of coming here, has been the capacity to be able to see those beautiful relics upstairs. Or the relic deposits, rather, not the relics themselves. And I was thinking that just as Buddhism transformed and started making images of the Buddha, and again, if you go upstairs to the gallery, you will see a manual for how to make images of the Buddha, right? Which shows the drawing processes involved in making images of the Buddha. Makes you think about if those are the ways in which the rules that exist for making even that which was not meant to be made. Another case in point for that is to be able to look at the many paintings that exist in the world of the Prophet. Were never meant to be made. But these come from, the one on the left comes from probably from Afghanistan. The one on the right comes from the Deccan. The one on the left was owned by the Sultans of Delhi. It shows the Prophet on Burak riding into the night sky, the Miraj. They come from Sufi Masnavis. They were very popular at one point in the 14th and 15th centuries, from the 14th to the 16th centuries, of making representations of the Prophet, which is completely haram and forbidden today, but was practiced at some point, where the desire to make an image is so strong. Now, this makes us put into context the desire for iconoclasm too, to think about the problems with making images, how the image becomes a contested site. So here, for instance, one of the most powerful pieces, political pieces, that I've had the opportunity to exhibit has been this example from the Kannauj Museum, which shows the Buddhist goddess Tara on one side and shows the Shaivite image of Ardhanarishwar on the other side. The Tara side is beaten up. It's been reused and turned into a Shaivite sculpture. The style of the two pieces is so close together that it seems that it's happened in the same generation, or maybe max one generation apart from the same workshop. What happened? Did the person who was once a Buddhist who commissioned this sculpture change his mind and say, no, I'm now Shaivite and I'd rather have an Ardhanarishwar for the temple instead? Or was it a case that the temple's affiliation was changed? Was it because of personal shift, or was it because of sectarian rivalry? We can't tell, but we want to know, but we can see that one image was lost in favor of another. That much at least we know. So images and visual culture become a way to be able to see and read much more into the images as well. Now that brought me to my next gallery on how we construct heroes for society. And again, I wanted to puncture the stereotypes. And, so I wasn't just looking at iconoclasm from Islamic perspective, but also looking at, there was a way to be able to juxtapose these ideas. So each of these galleries, like the opening gallery on hero stones, martyrs, the popular discourse on jihad and suicide bombers had reached such a point that it was necessary to put in a corrective and to be able to say, hold on, every society has done this. The necessity to be able to look at iconoclasm as not coming only from one society and one community, but actually being something that has been historically practiced within Protestants and Catholics and between Hindus and Buddhists and between Jains and other. This was necessary to look at the phenomenon, to not look at it as being isolated. And the museum can make an intervention. Because the museum, as I was saying, is the keeper of evidence. And that evidence is up to us to be able to present for each society and in each occasion for our audiences each time to be able to read it afresh. And the museum, therefore, needs tremendous protection because the evidence it holds is very precious. It's extremely important. So as you're seeing from example after example, it's something that it is telling us something new, I hope. I'm not just repeating ideas that you're familiar with, but I'm using and showing and demonstrating through the examples something new that, oh, this happened too, did it? For instance, Babar, worshipping with cow's milk, sprinkling cow's milk on each standard of each of the regiments of his army, and using a silk garland that you would have in the Tibetan concept, in the white silk, to tie to the calf, to the cow, and using the cow's milk to sprinkle each regiment's blazon, herald, before they marched forward. Not a very Muslim or Islamic ritual at all. Where's this culture coming from? What is the society within which this man's cultural habits are taken? And how important was this, that this Babarnama was illustrated for Akbar, his descendant? It's not made in the time of Babar. Why does Akbar want this episode to be painted? Hundreds of years later, he wants his descendants to remember who they were and where they came from and what their rituals must have been. And therefore, he wants it documented that this is what the Mughal history was. He wants his descendants to know that. And so there are interesting ways by which we can read these social histories and stories. We can look at female heroes like Draupadi. We can look at Kecharahuta over here, which comes from the Bhuta community in Tulunad. I wanted to bring ways to be able to bring, as I said, multiple communities and perspectives into view. I can't get into all of these because we don't have too much time, but I did want to talk about how we use these heroes for political purposes. And that's quite important. In the Indian national movement, some very interesting posters were produced as anti-colonial propaganda. In the run-up to independence, these posters in the 1930s had begun to be made from north, south, east, west, all over India as the tide against the British Empire in India was rising. These popular prints and posters are really quite interesting. Where are they getting their exemplars from? What aspects of the Indian psyche are they using? Who's coming up with these images? Where does propaganda and graphic design come from? And they were quite interesting because they actually immediately showed how iconographic exemplars that we had been looking at in the previous gallery on the bodies of gods was now being used for political purposes. And so you got the idea of the personification of Mother India as Bharat Mata, right? And those goddess images. But one of the best examples is that where she turns into a goddess whose sari is billowing and turning into the map of South Asia, rather aggrandizing map of South Asia. And she turns into an ascetic sadhu or sadhavi on the one hand, in the hand of Abanindranath Tagore. She turns into Durga, holding the Congress flag, right? And then the most exciting one, of course, is this. Am I audible to you without a mic?
Yes.
Yeah? Well, this is a fantastic story of a mythical character by the name of sage Markandeya, a story that comes up in the Bhagavad Purana. Markandeya was a devotee of Shiv. But it was prophesied that Markandeya would die at the age of 16. A very popular myth. So what Markandeya did was that from the age of 15 to 16, for a year, he went into a deep trance and penance and prayed to a Shivling. Prayed to Shiva in the form of a ling. And when he turned 16, the god of death, Yamaraj, Yama, the god of death, came to capture him, used his lasso and spun it to capture him. But this little boy, this teenager, 16-year-old man, was worshipping so hard, such concentration, that he was hugging the Shivling. So when he was captured, the lasso went not just on Markandeya, but also captured the symbol of Shiva alongside. And when the god of death yanked, the lingam of Shiva was also being yanked. So Shiva emerged from the linga and said, "Who has the impertinence to be able to capture me thus?" And Yama, the god of death, was banished, and Markandeya was blessed with eternity, right, as a gift. Now this myth was so popular that the graphic artists in the national movement used that myth, but interpolated it very interestingly. And so they make the British colonizer labeled Yamraj, the god of death, who has come to capture Markandeya, who is no longer a boy, but is Bharat Mata. Bharat Mata, who is praying to Shiv. And who is Shiv, who is going to bestow eternity? It's Gandhi, who is emerged out of the Shivling in the middle of the Indian freedom movement to give India its gift of eternity and independence. And importantly, Gandhi holds in his hands the weapons for that freedom. The charkha and the puni, right? The spinning wheel and the spindle, which he holds, but also the media. Gandhi's great weapon was the media. The media in both Urdu and Hindi was going to help Gandhi in that war to give India independence and eternity, right? So you see a completely political application of religion, of religious iconography. And it's important to be able to see this, how religious imagery has been manipulated and utilized time and again for political purposes. And there is no way of studying and coming to the museum context and imagine that it's going to be an apolitical exercise. It's always a political exercise. It can't not be a political exercise because every image is made within a certain context. As I was saying, the charming myth of Markandeya, of course, was picked up in other works of art. Markandeya eventually becomes a wizened old man and confronts the baby Krishna, sucking his toe, insouciant, alive, on the turbulent waters of chaos, of the cosmic waters of chaos, on a banyan leaf, because a banyan is the tree that is a symbol of eternity. It has not one root, but it lives forever. More roots and more roots and more roots. You never know which the original root was. So the artist used lots of metaphors to play with the myth of, because Markandeya may have been given the boon of eternity, but eternity can also be a great curse, as Markandeya realized, because he lived forever and ever, wondering why he's alive and how he's going to get out of this condition, till he sees Krishna laughing, joyous, playing with the cycle of birth and life, and in a state of eternal gurgling joy. And that eternal gurgling joy of the baby is what he's reminded about as the dialogue between the wizened man of eternity and that joyous baby. Is a great dialogue that's staged on that artwork. Anyway, exemplars of society exist nowadays through comic books. We come into the next part, which was about asceticism. And asceticism allows us to deal with a different kind of body, those who have exited the system. And what needs to be remembered is some of the most powerful and grandest human bodies made in South Asia are not of the gods. but are of men who have chosen to opt out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. It is the guru, it is the tirthankar, it is the hero who is the hero of the mind rather than the physical hero, who is the most valued. Right? And so you have these grand sculptures of ascetics. Now, this brought me to be able to look at the bhakti movement, to be able to look at the verses of the bhakti saints. My personal favorite, I think, again and again in the National Museum's collection is this particular Chola bronze of Manika Vachakar. Simple, minimal, for all that we see in East Asian art, in Indian art, with their crazy multiple arms and dynamism and movement and dazzling clothing and such richness and all of that and their ornateness. And then comes this. Minimal, nothing, clean, purity of line, gentleness of movement, so controlled. Manika Vachakar is walking towards us just gently as that knee is bent and he's just moved, that slight movement in his body. He gestures in vitarka, perfection. Body slight, lithe. That sensibility, that reserve, that poise, that's not normal. It requires great self-restraint to be able to make something as beautiful and subtle as this. You can take photographs of it in every possible angle, and it's just marvelous because of the subtlety with which it communicates. And that makes me think of some of the finest aspects of Chola bronzes that exist, not in the fury of the moving and dancing Nataraj, but actually in the bhakt of Nataraj, the one who sang verses in his honor. And those verses are quite remarkable. Manika Vachakar says, I wear a cassia garland and cling to Shiva's round shoulders. Locked in his embrace, I swoon. His red lips make me giddy with longing. My heart melting, I search everywhere and fix my thoughts on his feet. I wither, then I blossom once more. Let's sing about the red feet of the Lord who dances flame in hand. Let's sing an Amanai. A very powerful set of verse, written by a man about another man's masculine body. If I just look at it from the perspective of bodies, it's very powerful poetry. It's not poetry that's been cast into the voice of Radha for Krishna, but it's been cast into the voice of Manika Vachakar for Shiva. One also then needs to think about similar concepts. Is it happening only in Hindu bhakti, or is this also happening in Sufism? What is the nature of ishq? What is the nature of the murid and the seer? How does that actually work? What is the relationship between the divine and the worshipper? And the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh's sayings from his diary, along with his sister Jahan Ara Begum's, were placed in the gallery, along with these very powerful bits of poetry. Dara says, he exposed my chest, and having pulled the clothing away from his own chest under the left nipple, rubbed it against my nipple on the same side, and declared, take that with which I have been entrusted. And such a dazzling array of light, or multitude of dazzling light, from his blessed chest entered mine, that I cried, enough. Right? I mean, there is something very powerful that these people are experiencing in their divine delirium, and their bodies are undergoing, which takes us into a gallery which was called Rapture. And that was the last bit of the exhibition. The point of the exhibition was that if the self can be lost through rapturous love, it can be, we have seen in this exhibition how it was consumed by another, then it becomes that the body is only a temporary vessel, and this temporary vessel need not be filled by one self alone. Many believe that the body can be possessed by spirits, divine or malevolent. Possessions are rituals, but they are also aesthetic experiences. Despite the knowledge that the body is transient and that the world is only an illusion, much is written in Indian texts that celebrates the body as the field of experience and the senses. And this is another limitation, another caveat of what the museum can do. Taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound are what attach the mind to life. But we in the museum privilege sight only. We can't really deal with the other senses. It may be a life that is only temporary and yet remains a means to truth. But what is truth? Is art real? Do the performers, listeners, or viewers, absorbed as they are in an imaginarium, mistake illusion for reality? Does it matter if illusion is reality, or do we allow it to be that way? What is real when even stones can be consecrated with a divine spirit and made to come alive? Everything's alive then, by that yardstick. These kinds of questions are not my questions. These questions are as old as art making. They've always been there. And so the important thing was to see how have others responded to these questions, right? And how did they deal with this fundamental question of what is art? This one, for instance, was the star piece in this little miniature with this incandescent play of red, orange, and fuchsia and deep red and carmine sort of all together in that, where Radha and Krishna turn into one body. What we did rather cleverly, I thought, with Sabine Tunis and my exhibition designer, was that we were on such a shoestring budget that we decided that we would carpet the gallery in red, and we could have done a better job. And as I said, our budget completely bust. But what we did was that she did something very clever. All the artwork, as you can see, and these were Ragamala paintings taking you through the 8 prahar, the 8 divisions of the 24 hours. And ragas that are meant for the very early morning started the cycle of the gallery, and ragas that are meant for the deep night ended the gallery. And all these artworks, as you can see, are in the clear, clean light. But when the people were in the gallery, they were all colored red. Right? The people had transformed, the people had become art, and art had become real. Art was in the clear light of day and spoke its own truth. It was the people who were transformed and enraptured. And that was sort of, along with that, we had this transposition of the transformation, where Radha becomes Krishna and Krishna becomes Radha. They turn into each other because there is a loss of the self. So he has put on, it's not just a painting about cross-dressing. It is, I mean, that is literally what you're looking at, but it's about so much more. It's about him becoming her and she becoming him, and how she then seduces him rather than him seducing her. And she takes the veil off him while he lives there. He looks up shy as a bride at her who is wearing the crown of Krishna. Right? So it's that transformation of the self that takes place through these processes of poetry and art. It brought me to the end of the show, where we ended with this great classic dialogue from the Vishnu Dharmottar Purana. There's a conversation, it's a 6th century text, where the king asks his minister on what's the best way for him to his own education. And he says, tell me about the making of deities, tell me about art. And the sage Markandeya replies to him and says, O Lord of men, he who does not know properly the rules of painting cannot discern anything in sculpture. He can't actually make out what is a fine work of art. He has to first be taught sketching and painting. So he says, all right, if I need to learn sketching and painting, then please narrate the rules of painting. And Markandeya says, well, without a knowledge of the art of dancing, the rules of painting are very difficult to understand because you don't understand the body. If you don't know how to understand dance, if you haven't danced yourself, you'll never know. So he says, oh, all right, well then, tell me about the art of dancing. He says, well, the practice of dancing is difficult to be understood by one who is not acquainted with music. So I suggest you first go for music lessons. So Vajra says, well, tell me about music, and then tell me about dancing, and then tell me about sketching, and then tell me about painting, and then tell me about sculpture, which is what I've come to learn about. So he said that, well, actually, if you want to learn music and dance, you have to first know about rhythm. Because if you don't know about rhythm, then how will you know about music? He said, well, then teach me how to play a percussion instrument. And he said, well, actually, all music is ultimately about the melody, and it's about the voice. And until you know how to sing, you can't know anything else. And so, it's about, until you've discovered your voice, you will not discover anything else. And that's quite interesting, because it brought us back to the beginning of the exhibition about the word and about the voice, that being at the heart of knowledge and communication. And so I think the exhibition on the body allowed us to deal with a variety of these things. And there were problems, there were all kinds of issues that we had to deal with. For instance, when I was recording the ragamalas for the music, we had to have a special orchestra that was trained, because the painting was a 16th century painting or a 17th century painting. And the way in which that rag is sung today is not the way it was sung 300 years ago. We know within the 100 years of recorded history of Indian rags how notes have changed, how scales have changed in those rags. And as a result, going back to recording it, every rag in the way in which it might have been at that time, was certainly not an easy task. And that required its own team of researchers and its own team of people working on that to be able to get the singers to say, and the players to say, well, when you play Vibhas, I don't want it with a Tivra Dhaivat, but I want it with a Komal. When you play this rag, I want it done like that, and change this note for this. And producing a rag like Deepak, that was very challenging, because nobody sings it. And nobody plays it. And so training people on that required a lot of musicological research, actually. So it was great fun and a great learning curve, and it truly helped in the capacity building of the discipline of art history and museology to be able to see where we are going. As I've tried to communicate, I hope, the caveats that are necessary in understanding the body as a rubric, is that the body allows for a diversity of views on a matter to be staged together, where one point of view can balance another. It can raise questions. The job of the museum is not to only instruct, but is also to provoke. It is to provoke you to think about issues. The job of the museum is not only to be didactic, but is to be participatory. And if the museum has to perform those roles, you must allow the museum its autonomy to be able to do that. Because otherwise, you're just going there as a consumer who's always right. And then you just might as well be going to the mall. And that's a very important difference, I think, that needs to be maintained for the space of the museum. Well, that's it. These were some of the ideas I wanted to share with you today. I thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shaman. I know it's been quite a long talk, but I think we probably just have time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are any from the audience. Anyone?
Actually, maybe I could ask something first, Prof. Ahuja, before, while our audience members are thinking. Could you talk a little bit about the audience response to the exhibition? Like, you kind of allude to it at some points, but you haven't really talked about it.
Very interesting. In the beginning of the exhibition, you see, the great challenge for me in a multicultural society was to be able to translate this exhibition and make it accessible into commonly understood language. Because some of the ideas, they're burning political questions and they're relevant for the people. But how does one say it without falling foul of the government or without falling foul of, to be able to raise them as strategic questions? And I've seen that you've done that very well in this museum in a few places. I've been noticing some of the signs. So we translated them. Again, this is a practice that you're already doing over here, but it's not commonly done in India. So we spent a lot of time, and the official translations that I got in Hindi were so Sanskritized that people would never have understood them. So I had to sit down and patiently rework the translations into commonly understood Hindustani. And that's one of the things I did myself. Even when I was thinking of the entire show, I narrated the entire exhibition to myself, not in English, but in Hindi. And that helped me in my choice of objects as well, because some of the objects which were cliches, I was just like, don't be ridiculous. The people don't need to be told this. They already have this information on Wikipedia. They need to be told that strategic question. Having done that exercise, the reason I mention this is I think that made a massive difference to the public participation and audience response, because after about the first 3 weeks, the usual intelligentsia and bourgeois sort of community and upper middle classes who come to the museum, usually the audience starts, that audience had cleared out. They'd all seen the show. And the audience numbers usually start dwindling. And we found that our numbers were in fact rising. And that made me take a step back. One day, a friend of mine who was in the gallery on a Sunday with me, about 3 months into the show, nudged me and says, "Can you look at all these chaps in the gallery? Look at them carefully." And I said, "Yeah, what about them?" He said, "Look at their haircuts." And everyone in the gallery had a crew cut. And he said, "They're all in the army." And they had come with their spouses. And then we began to discover that the week prior, 2 weeks ago, a few weeks prior, the police services that were in charge of the security of the exhibition had found the exhibition so much fun and so exciting that they'd shared it with others. And now, instead of going to the mall on Sunday and going for a movie, they had brought their partners and their wives to come to see this exhibition. Says, and then we started listening in and overhearing the conversations. And there were things like, "Yeah, when I was posted in Kashmir, that's what I saw over there." And they were sharing this information. And the museum became a very participatory space with serious issues about crowd control and things like that. So we tipped you would imagine that, oh, this is so highly philosophical that the public won't like it. But the public is very tuned into philosophy. Philosophy is free, Everyone sort of tunes into ideas philosophical. It's art looking, where you think about all these things about volume and nothingness in a different way, where it becomes more hard to grasp. But otherwise, all of this was much easier to grasp for the general public, it seems. So, yeah.
We have 2 questions here.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to find out more about the body as a tool of healing in sense of spiritual. Maybe could you share more about that journey? Like, I think as I was coming earlier, I heard you share about the practices in India and now in the present. Maybe could you share that journey and how it has transformed or evolved?
One of the interesting things is that in Indian medical texts are not illustrated. All the ancient Ayurvedic texts that I managed to find from the great libraries of the world, the most ancient Ayurvedic texts don't have diagrams. And that was a little bit frustrating as a museum curator, because I wanted to show, I was hunting for art to show the body. And so one of the first places I went to start researching was in Ayurvedic literature. And the most ancient manuscripts that I found were texts. It's like the most ancient texts on yoga, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, has no diagrams of asanas. There are no asanas of Hatha Yoga in those texts. They're just meditation manuals. It tells you about all these other things. So there were these systems for healing and for the somatic body and all of that, but They are texts, they are not illustrated. So in an exhibition, what do I do with them? You know, and in an art exhibition, I was limited from my perspective in what I could do. The other way of answering your question is that can art itself be healing? That's another way to interpret your question. Dara Shikoh certainly thought so. And he gathered a group of ancient pundits who had ancient knowledge, and went into a long discourse with them and preserved a particular book in Farsi, which relies on older Sanskrit works, which we also have access to, where every note in music has an effect on a different station of the body, on a different chakra. And that body of knowledge is quite interesting because they believe that music has a physical effect on the body, not just changing the mood, which is extremely important for the healing process, as we know, for any condition. So for healing, music, using music therapeutically was something that they were tuned into. I'm sorry for the pun. But the other thing was looking at music, does a visual perform a similar healing role? And yes, it does, because that Akbar manuscript, which has the talismanic effect of looking at an artwork, looking at something representational, can have an effect on the body. So it becomes a way of healing a particular condition. So there is some thinking about that too. But I think all of these, for us in modern parlance, certainly, I mean, other than the soundscape, which can talk about vibrational quality, but otherwise, we're looking at, I don't know what sight does to to you physiologically. I don't know how visualization of something can affect the body, but they believe that it did. There are certain texts that do talk about that. I don't know if we have enough material to be able to mount exhibitions on that, though. One of my key concerns was also to look at representations of infirmity in some way in Indian art. Not that easy to find. There are all these perfect bodies and ideal bodies and heroic bodies and lots of sensuous female bodies, not that many sensual male bodies. It's not. It's exactly. It's the opposite in Greco-Roman art, isn't it? Where you, so you do. There are issues that come up, culture-specific curatorial problems that we encounter. I don't know if that's partly answered your question.
Just one last question.
Hi, Naman. I enjoyed that talk very much. One theme that particularly caught my attention was how iconoclasm must not be restricted to the sphere of Islam, and that it needs to be acknowledged as a phenomenon that cuts across religious and cultural contexts. So, as an academic and a curator, how do you propose museums engage this theme actively and perhaps even urgently?
I've written 2 papers about this very, very subject. I can give you an entire long lecture about this matter. On my academia page, there are 2 articles that you could look at. One is called Discourse on a Label, Exposing Narratives of Violence, which was published by the Collège de France, which deals with the role that museums, the responsibility, and the other one is called Conflict Can Museums Tell Me Why, which was published by Marg. And these are 2 articles that are there. Conflict Can Museums Tell Me Why is a much more pithy version of the longer article. and it's far less philosophical than the discourse on a label is. My contention is that, firstly, museum art has always been a space to be able to stage conflict. This is not something that we will be inventing for the first time. We as museum curators are not taking this responsibility on. Institutions of art, as Abhinav Gupta says, the great philosopher from Kashmir of the 10th century, he says, you should recite the Mahabharata again and again for the public. Why? Because they will hear so many stories of carnage and brother killing brother and bloodletting that goes on in that vivid text, that the urge of violence will be purged from that society. They'll hear about so much violence, and you must communicate that violence with the full vigor that you can, so that the violence is something that you are communicating. The history and story and narrative of conflict is so important because it'll transform the thinking of, it acts as a kind of a social catharsis. So the rasa of conflict is as much a responsibility as the rasa of Shringar, knowing how to communicate that. It's not just going to the museum for seeing the beauty of art, but to be able to make the audience shocked, revulsed, brought to tears, all of that. And the long history of conflict is as much an aesthetic exercise. Now, if you take that aesthetic endeavor and understand that as the role of the museum as much, if you use that as an enabling tool, you certainly have historical precedents for what a museum can do, what today a museum can function as. I tried to locate 11 or 12 examples from Indian sculpture. My field is really Indian sculpture. And so I tried to find 12 examples of sculptures that each were used in the public space, beheaded, broken, shattered, and each one was a different cause and a different kind of iconoclasm. One was because of gender violence. Not because iconoclasm because of one religion against another, but because of a gendered nature of violence. Another one is an example of economic need, where somebody needed the stone that sculpture was made of, even if it was a sculpture of a god, because they didn't have any other stone, and they needed to sharpen their agricultural instruments. So they used that stone. That valley, that area has no stone to be able to use, and so all these bodies, these stones, these sculptures might have been used because they needed the stone for something else. It was driven by need, not driven to destroy because of hatred by one community against another. So I've looked at multiple causes for what leads to iconoclasm, and within iconoclasm, I've also religious iconoclasm. I've looked at it across sectarian boundaries, and then comes in the last part of my discussion on what is the right tone and responsible way for us as academics and as curators to communicate that history. How do you use the museum as what's the tone that the museum needs to take when communicating such histories of violence? Because otherwise you'll end up doing the very opposite. Instead, you'll end up inciting violence, right? So how do you not become an institution that incites the violence, but instead becoming an institution that exposes it to make the public aware of how violence has been perpetrated? And so there's a tone that one needs to take in one's writing, in one's communication. And that is extremely important, why one needs to be responsible about that. And that is an endeavor that we must spend time teaching our curators and editors on how to do. I hope that it can always remain just an endeavor. I don't think we'll ever master it, but it has to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick.
Well, I just wanted to ask, how do you overcome the inherent sterility of a museum setup? Because you spoke about context, creating context, creating the optimal environment to appreciate an object as beyond just an art object, to give it the context. But museums, by at least in the current sort of decade or so, are slightly sterile. They are devoid of context. How do you create that rich context that most objects of art have? How do you present that?
With difficulty, with some attitude towards a balance. You don't want to rob the aesthetic joy of an object, right? It is extraordinarily beautiful as well. You want to be able to appreciate that. And yet you can't see it separated from the way it might have functioned. And which context are you going to privilege? Whose context? The devotees, the priests, the shift in the meaning of that object, the context of its provenance history, which story do you want to tell? I mean, every object can tell so many different contexts. Exactly.
History of displacement.
All of those histories, each of those contexts make for an important narrative. So we've been arguing in museum circles that the museum can now become a space for harnessing so many other professionals to collaborate with the museum. So from the police and the detective and the provenance historian and the person who is their story, the story of the priest who knows about it, the devotees that once went, the bhakti specialist who actually looked at that sculpture and knows about the story, the dancer who has emulated that and tried to reconstruct contemporary dance based on that classical sculpture. I mean, the narratives and contexts that it enables are several, is what I'm. And they can each become oral histories that can now be preserved very well through video documentation, accessible to those who want it, without it cluttering the gallery space, where the evidence remains there. And as I said, for each generation, the museum can reinterpret and make available new narratives that evidence can enable. Because one has to also be aware of one's limitations as a curator living now. The object in that institution is going to live on for many more generations than my engagement with that and what I can enable for my public. So my successor, curator, has to be able to have the object available to herself or himself to be able to mobilize its narratives for their audiences, which will ask many more questions than we do. After all, those that went to the Pitt Rivers Museum in the 1860s asked one set of questions that museum was responding to. That doesn't make that museum invalid or worthy only of our critique. It's an extremely important set of questions that provided certain contexts for understanding the world as was relevant to people in the 1860s. And we will be similarly critiqued for the narratives that we put out. Because our narratives will be considered irrelevant 50 years later. There'll be many other questions to be asked of the same sculptures and the same artworks. So they are, and they will keep changing, and new histories will come up. And that must be understood, because that's what makes the conservation wing in the museum extremely important, that the object has to survive. The object has to be able to live on.
So these kind of smaller exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, are a way of getting across a richer story.
They are, very much so. Yes.
Many apologies. But, we would really need to wrap up this session here today. There are refreshments outside. Thank you so much for staying through this talk. Next Saturday, we will also have a panel discussion related to Veil the Burden Dance. And this will actually feature members of the community, the makers, and the bearers. So, if you have time, please come next Saturday, I think at 4:30? Yeah, at 4:30 in this auditorium. Thank you. And another round of applause as well for...
Thank you.